Just cross my legs.
So on these stories,
Are we rolling?
yeah, on these stories like the red tape orphans, why was it important for you to get that information?
Well, I was not only a reporter, I was a human being, a part of the world, and I was indignant about, you see, in those days, and that some of it still exists, some people thought that anybody on welfare was no account. These people couldn't help the situation they were in any more than a lot of people who are now on welfare could help. And they were even more scorned in those days, because now we have a whole generation or two or three of acceptance of the fact that people have to be helped and that the taxpayers' money can be used to do it. And, well, wherever you go, whether you're reporting or not, if you see human cruelty and human exploitation and corruption of any kind, you try to do something about it. And if you're a reporter, you often can do something about it.
Well, in 1936, you left the Knoxville News Sentinel to come to New York City.
Right.
In the height of the Depression.
Right.
You quit a good job.
Right.
And moved to New York City by yourself.
Right.
Why?
Why? Well, there were many reasons. I always, ever since I could remember and read, I wanted to go to New York City. I used to read O.O. McIntyre's column and Mark Hellinger's column about New York and Broadway, and I read O. Henry's short stories about New York and others, and New York, and I read about Edna St. Vincent Millay and Eugene O'Neill and all these village characters romping around, and it just seemed to me like the place to be if you were going to be a writer. I used to think it'd be wonderful to live in an attic and write poetry the way Edna St. Vincent Millay did. So it was always in the back of my mind to go to New York. In 1934, I had 2 weeks vacation a year. I began to use a week in the spring and a week in the fall of my vacation to come to New York and look for a job. I had a scrapbook under my arm, and I had a list of people to see, and I had letters of introduction from people in Knoxville to editors and people in New York that might be helpful. And I spent the whole week going. There were then 8 or 10 newspapers in the city. I think there were 8 newspapers in Manhattan. There were 3 in Brooklyn. There were 2 in Queens, in Long Island City. And I went to all of the Manhattan papers twice a year, 34 and 35. And then 36, I did it again. And I thought, well, they're not going to hire me they're not going to take the responsibility of hiring me from another job. I will just have to quit and try to get a job. Then they'll see I'm really in earnest. So I made the round. I wasn't sure I'd have the nerve to quit, but I left I left my affairs in Knoxville in such a way that I wouldn't have to go back. I sublet my apartment, and
you were no longer married at this point, so you didn't have to. You were no longer married.
Oh no, I started doing this after 1934 when I was divorced. And I started laying my plans now that I was free now to come to New York. Also, the newspaper guild, which had been formed just a year or 2 before, I believe, in New York City, was forming units all over the country, and our printers suggested that we ought to form a newspaper guild. Well, we were outraged by that. That was for people in overalls. And they began to tell us how much they earned, compared with what we earned and point out that they got paid for overtime, and they had more vacations, so we got more and more interested, and the situation was sped. The formation of the Guild unit was sped by the fact that the editor we had, whom we all adored, began to hit the bottle and disappear, and was moved away and replaced by a terrible person. We all hated him, and he hated us, and he was just a terrible editor. So all of a sudden, we had all had such fun, and by the way, while I was there, the TVA was forming, and I was writing stories about that. And the stores up and down the main street were opening up, with a lot of them with offices for the TVA. And it was a thrill to be on a paper like that was campaigning for the TVA and the New Deal, and in a place that was beginning to revive. And he came along, and he was so, well, words fail me. It was as if the foam went off the beer completely. So we formed a guild, but we did it secretly with the help of the printers. In those days, there was a terrible fear of communism, and if one of us had been known to receive mail from the New York Guild, we could have been accused of being communists. So we had the mail sent to the printers, and we had the charter sent to the printers. And when the charter came to the printers, they gave it to us. Then we came out and unveiled ourselves. And this editor was so shocked, he didn't know what to do. In those days, we worked 6 days a week, and if we were working on a story that continued, it was expected that we stay with it, so that when election time came, you worked Friday, Saturday night, Sunday night. You just kept going on you stayed with the story until it was over. Well, the Guild said you can't do that. The NRA, the National Labor Relations Act, which was passed then, under which they said you can't do that. And the newspaper said, oh, well, we're different. We have to do that. We have to keep our people on a story until it's finished. And we have to have them work 5.5 days a week regularly. And the NRA said, no, 5 days a week. And if it's important enough to keep them at it, you have to pay them overtime. This was a terrible adjustment for publishers all over to make.
And that was at the Knoxville News Sentinel.
This was at the Knoxville News Sentinel. This was the first guild formed in the South, and I was a secretary-treasurer. I had a big role in it. So I had this responsibility. At the same time, I was planning to go to New York, and I felt that I'd be walking out on my obligations if I didn't do something about that. So there was another woman reporter. She was a food writer on the paper, a very conscientious person. And I began conning her, really, into the fact that if I stayed in New York on this trip, she ought to take over the job of secretary-treasurer, how exciting it was, and so forth and so on, and how much good she'd be doing. And then I started conning the members and saying, I'm going to try to get a job in New York, and if I don't come back, I think Bernice would make a wonderful secretary-treasurer. Well, this is what happened. In fact, Bernice and I came up together that time, and I tried, and she went back. I stayed. I wasn't sure I'd have the nerve to, but I went to the theater my last night here, and I don't remember whether I saw a street scene or anyway, it had a very sad last act, and I started crying, and I couldn't stop crying, and the theater emptied, and the cleaning women came around, and they tapped me and said, you have to go, we have to close up. I couldn't get out of my seat. I was crying so hard, and I wasn't really crying about this show anymore. I was crying about myself and this decision I had to make, because if I was not going back, I had to telegraph them that night. So I finally pulled myself together and walked to the Vanderbilt Hotel where I was staying. And in the lobby of the Vanderbilt was a Western Union desk and a blousy blonde sitting there. And I went over and I wrote out this telegram. I struggled over it. I didn't want to lie, but I wanted it to sound like I wasn't being absolutely foolish throwing away a job. So I wrote the telegram and to this despised editor, and I said, please accept my resignation. Have chance of job here. Well, I wasn't lying. I believed I had a chance of job. I didn't say I had a job. Have chance of job here. And I handed this. Well, my experience with telegraph people had been that they didn't pay any attention, that you could hand a telegram saying I just killed somebody and I'm on the lam, and they would just tap it out and pay no attention. But when I handed this to her, she looked at it and she said, canning a job. I haven't seen a message like this in 10 years. Well, this sort of unstrung me again. I was just holding myself together barely, and so she said, how do you want to pay for this, dearie? And I said, I want to send it press rate. I knew there was a press rate, but I didn't know what press rate was, really. She said, well, if you send a press rate, you have to send it collect. Oh, I said, I don't want to send it collect. Well, she said, go ahead and send it press rate, dearie. And by this time, I was more and more unstrung. I couldn't argue with her, so I just walked away. Well, they say that when this wire arrived, this man came out waving it from his office and saying, and she sent it collect. I didn't really want to send it collect, but that's the way it turned out.
Well, it took you 18 hard months to find a newspaper job.
Oh, yes, it did.
And I think you talked before about how you had your scrapbook and you'd go and visit everyone.
Right.
But you finally landed a job on the New York Post.
On the New York Post. In February, I went there February 1, 1938. And I was really a reporter. And in the interim, I had done various other jobs, including one at Life magazine, which was then beginning, and which had laid me off 2 weeks before Christmas after telling me that I was doing wonderfully well. And I wrote a long letter of protest about this to the editor, saying it was a hell of a way to run a railroad. I had inquired about how I was doing, and I had turned down a couple of other jobs. And he was so distressed, he said, well, we'll try to find you something else. And he did. He sent me to Fortune to be interviewed, and Fortune sent word that they had a job for me as a researcher for $50 a week, at the same time that I found I had the job on the New York Post as a reporter for $25 a week. So I wrote him a very snotty letter and said, no thank you, I'm going to be a reporter on the New York Post.
So you'd rather have been a reporter on the New York Post for $25?
Right. Than a researcher on Fortune for $50. I came to New York to be a reporter. I mean, I had these other jobs, some of which had possibilities, but that's not why I came here.
And it turned out that this job at the New York Post lasted how long?
6 months. The New York Post, which was then a full-size paper and owned by the Stern family in Philadelphia, was having hard times. And on one day, they laid off 50 reporters, the whole financial department, the whole society department. And I was the newest reporter there, and I was laid off. I was covering that day a story of a man who was trying to commit suicide by jumping off the Gotham Hotel. And I was hoping that I would get away before he jumped. This I didn't want to see. I was phoning into a rewrite man who'd been there for years. He was laid off. And the photographer who was with me all day, he was laid off. We were all three among those laid off. But when I got through with this story, I called in to get a good night, and the city editor said, come in. And I thought, oh boy, I'm going to get an out-of-town assignment, because usually at the end of the day, they would say good night and you'd be through. I went in and I went sashaying over to the city desk, and here I am. And he didn't even look up. he said, I got bad news for you. Looking down, I said, bad news? I mean, who could have bad news for me? I finally had this job, and I was having wonderful stories, wonderful assignments, and enjoying it, working with wonderful people. He said, you're let out. This is a phrase I'd never heard, but I knew the meaning. And I just looked at him at the top of my voice. You could have heard me blocks away. I said, why? And he said, don't ask me, I just work here. Well, I found out later that, if anybody went, I had to. I'd been there, plus which he'd been handed a list of people to fire. This was the assistant city editor, by the city editor. And he had gone down that list, and he had said, you can't fire her. And this guy said, that's the list. So
it then took you a while to get back into journalism.
It did indeed.
In fact, it was 1941.
Right.
When you were hired by the AP.
Right.
And so how did you get back into journalism?
Well, in the meantime, it was 41 or 42. In the meantime, I got another job that I hated, and I lost 25 pounds, and I was depressed and so forth. But I ran into a reporter that had worked with me on the News Sentinel in Radio City, and it was in 42, I think. And he started out as a young kid while I was a mature reporter there. We embraced each other, and he said, well, what are you doing? And I told him, and he said, but you should be reporting. I said, you know that, and I know that, but nobody else seems to know that. Well, he said, I'm working at the Associated Press. I'm going to speak to my boss about you. He did, and the boss sent for me, and he hired me. I couldn't believe this. And I said, well, I'm just delighted. I said, you don't know how long I've been trying to get a job and get back and well, I had given up at this time, but, well, he said, there are very few women reporters around now. You see, the war had started and the men had gone away. And I said, it's your own damn fault. He said, there are very few women reporters with experience. I said, it's your own damn fault you wouldn't let us get experience. So I went to work there, and I stayed there until I got married again. 1945. I kept on working for a while, but I retired in 1945 from the newspaper business.
Because you were going to get married?
No, after I got married.
Oh, I know, but was it?
I was going to devote my futures to making a home for my husband. And writing, and maybe getting back to poetry. But anyway, I retired from the newspaper business, I thought.
Well, let me ask you, at the AP, sometimes you had to do 2 and 3 stories a day.
Oh, always. It was a assembly line production. Because you didn't go in, you didn't go, as I had been accustomed to doing, go out, gather the information, go in, write it. You went out, you would get an assignment. Can we turn that off? I got to get a drink of water.
Sure.
Sorry.
You want me to get it?
You had to do 2 and 3
Oh,
stories a
yes.
day.
All right. Tell me when we're on. Is my head all right? My glasses all right?
You look good. So, going to the AP, you had to do 2 and 3 stories a day.
Oh, yes. You would get a call at home to go someplace. You'd cover that, telephone your story, then be sent someplace else. Cover that, telephone your story, then be sent someplace else. You could be sent 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different places. It was very hard work, not only because you had so many, and they were all entirely different stories. This is during the war. There were all sorts of meetings going on, and bond rallies, and conventions, and discussions of the post-war period. I got so to the point I was making notes, I just put PWP every other word that some speaker was making a speech. And you didn't have a chance to do any research, look up any background. I mean, you'd be told to go to the Astor Hotel where there was a medical convention. You'd get there and grab all these programs and bios and so forth and so on, try to master the background, then go in and listen. Usually there would be 6 or 7 lectures going on at the same time at these conventions, and you'd have to decide which one to go to, and you'd have to read the speech of the one you didn't go to. It was very hard work.
Also, you
very good training. And when I first went there, I would call in notes. And finally, they said, you can't do this. You have to dictate your story. We don't have time to take your notes and rewrite them into a story. And I remember the day this happened, I was in town hall covering something. I don't remember what. And I went out, the town hall lounge has sofas and chairs around. I went out there and I sat down there and I thought, oh. So this reporter that I knew on PM came over and said, what's the matter with you? You look like you just lost your last friend. I said, I feel like it. I've just been told that I can't telephone notes anymore. I have to dictate the story. I can't do that. Oh, sure you can, he said. I'll tell you how I learned how to do it. First, you write out the whole story in pencil, and you get on the phone and you read it. And he said you'll find out later that you only have to write half of it, and you can dictate the rest of it. And then you'll find out you only have to write the lead, and then you can dictate the rest of it. And eventually, he said, you'll just be able to come out and step in a phone and start dictating. I said, oh, well, that will be the day. Well, the day did come. It's amazing the things you can learn to do if you have to.
And also when you were at the AP, I believe it was, you told me a story about an editor wanted you to ask Mrs. Roosevelt a question that you were uncomfortable with.
Right. Well, a lot of my time at the AP was spent covering Mrs. Roosevelt. She was up here a lot. Of course, FDR was president, and she went every place they invited her and answered every question they answered. She was an amazing woman, and she would wear me out by the end of the day, although she was old enough to be my grandmother. And she's the only person I know who would get up in a large public gathering and answer any question put to her. If you will notice other places where you go, notice at the National Press Club, you have to write the question out and it's collected and the chairman takes the question and reads them to the person. Mrs. Roosevelt didn't do that. She answered any question that was put to her from the floor. And she made a few, she was criticized for a lot of things that she said because she always spoke her mind. She spoke frankly. But it's amazing she didn't get in more trouble than she did when she was taking these questions that way. Well, I was covering LaGuardia. He was always running around, too, opening things. He was at the Board of Education meeting, opening some sort of an exhibit. And at this particular time, he was having a feud with the press. And so when I went there at City Hall, and he was refusing to talk to them. So I went to this Board of Education. I was told to go there where he's going to open an exhibit. And then I was told to go to the Astor Hotel where Mrs. Roosevelt was appearing. I got to the Board of Education at 10 o'clock and waited for him. He showed up, and I said, are you going to have anything to say here? Because I have someplace else to go. And, well, no. So he looked up at me, and he said, get away from me, because I was a reporter. Well, I was taller than he was, so I reached my hand out on his shoulder, and I said, aren't you ashamed of yourself? Well, he really melted. He was ashamed of himself. And I said, are you going to have anything to say here? He said, I don't know. Do you want me to say anything? I said, I don't care whether you say anything or not, but if you do, I'd like to know because I have to go to another meeting. So he said something, and then I telephoned what he said, and while I was on the phone, the editor came on and he said, I have a question for you to ask Mrs. Roosevelt. I have 2 questions for you to ask Mrs. Roosevelt. One is, there's a rumor that Fala is pregnant. That was their Scotty dog. I said, my God, the wife of the President of the United States, she's addressing a huge ballroom full of people, and I have to ask her if Fala is pregnant. But he said, we have another question we want you to ask her. There is a man standing in Congress now, I forget who it was, a congressman, denouncing her. He says that last week she was at a a CIO dance. And as the band played Let Me Call You Sweetheart, she was urging white women into the arms of black men. And ask her what she has to say about that. Well, you know, race feelings were much more acute then than they are now. And a thing like that said to her, and then anything she said about it, she couldn't win. So I protested. I said, well, you have to ask her. Well, I went over to the Astor Hotel, and I got hold of her, and I said, I have two horrible questions to ask you, Mrs. Roosevelt. One is that my office wants to know, is it true that Fowler is pregnant? I don't remember her answer to that. And then I said, and then I have this other one, and I described it to her. And as I described it to her, I felt more and more and more indignant about having to ask it. So I finally said, you don't have to answer that if you don't want to. Oh, she said, of course I'll answer it. She said, and my mouth dropped. She said, I did go to a union dance last week. There was a band there. They may have played Let Me Call You Sweetheart. I don't remember. She said, I don't remember seeing white women dancing with black men, but there are both blacks and whites who belong to that union, and they have a right to dance with whomever they please. She was wonderful.
How many times did you get instructions from an editor that you didn't want to follow like that?
Oh, lots of times. Well, I wouldn't say that I was reluctant to follow. Lots of times.
How did you handle that?
Well, I did it with two exceptions. I did it. Two exceptions only two that I can remember. I was doing a nursing home investigation for the New York Times, and the city editor asked me to go around to nursing homes and pretend that I wanted to place my mother. And I said, I can't do that. I can't lie convincingly. I can go there and I can let them know I'm a reporter and I can dig out whatever can be done, but I can't go there and pretend to be somebody shopping. So he said, okay, you don't have to. The other time was when I was at the Associated Press, and it was either VJ Day or VE Day, I forget which, and all hell was breaking loose in Times Square. You know, a lot of soldiers and sailors and drunks and yelling and screaming and so forth. The AP wanted me to go around to nightclubs and write a story about this, and I said, I'm not going to do it. You can send a man around to do that. I'm not going to go around and get mixed up with a lot of drunken sailors and drunken soldiers. 2 and 3 in the morning.
And that was okay?
That was okay.
How did you maintain?
He didn't like it. The first one understood. He didn't press it at all. The second one was a different type person. This stupid idea anyway. Why send me around? They had men to do this. But you see, they say, well, you say you're a woman, you can do anything a man can do, so they pick the worst things to try to make you prove that sometimes.
Were there other things you think where they were trying to make you?
Oh, of course, of course. Of course. I mean, a lot of men are male chauvinist pigs, a lot of them, and a lot of them are in the newspaper business. It takes, it takes a man who's secure in himself to be able to be on an equal footing with a woman in the same business. And the world's not full of them.
Were there other... Okay.